is 100% fiction. All elements are imaginary. Coincidences with reality are accidental. Bill 18. Entertainment only. I fell in love with Klaus Morrow on a rainy Tuesday when he returned my umbrella. It wasn't a grand gesture. No flowers, no candle-lit dinner. None of those scenes I'd read about in romance novels and dismissed as fantasies for women with too much free time. It was simply him, 6'3" of tattooed danger, the most feared man in 3 states, the heir to an empire I preferred not to discuss at dinner tables, crouching down on the wet sidewalk to pick up the umbrella the wind had ripped from my hand, shaking off the water and handing it back without saying a single word. He looked at me for 3 seconds, then kept walking. It took me 2 more weeks to find out he'd sent 2 men to follow me home that night, just to make sure I got there safely. That's how it starts, I thought, when I finally found out. That's exactly how it starts with these men. We got married 11 months later. It wasn't a small ceremony. With the Morrow family, nothing was small, but it was ours. Klaus had insisted on only one thing, that I choose every detail. The music, the flowers, the dress, the menu. You only get married once, he said with that seriousness he put into everything. Do it the way you want. I wanted simple. He said fine. I wanted intimate. He said fine. I wanted none of the guests to come armed. He went silent for a full 6 seconds, which I'd learned was the Klaus Morrow equivalent of an existential crisis, and then said, I'll see what I can do. They came armed, concealed. I counted it as a win. What stayed with me from that day wasn't the dress or the flowers. It was the moment Klaus saw me walk in. He had his back to the aisle talking to Drago, his head of security, the man who'd been his shadow since they were teenagers, and when he turned, when he saw me coming down toward him with the bouquet in my hands, and my red hair pinned up in a way that had cost me 2.5 hours of bobby pin torture, he simply stopped. He didn't smile right away. First, he just looked. With those dark brown eyes I'd learned to read better than anyone else on earth, and what I saw in them wasn't pride, wasn't desire, wasn't the satisfaction of a man who'd conquered something. It was disbelief, like he still couldn't convince himself it was real. Gorgeous idiot, I thought, with every ounce of tenderness I had. Of course it's real. Raphael was born on a March night, screaming with a fury he clearly inherited from his father. Klaus stood beside the bed for 12 hours of labor without a single complaint. He held my hand. He let me squeeze. He didn't say a word when I, somewhere between hour 8 and hour 10, called him 23 different names that I won't repeat here. When the doctor placed Raphael in his arms, red-faced, furious, absurdly small, Klaus stood very still for a long moment. Then he looked at me. There were tears in his eyes. Klaus Morrow, the man 3 rival bosses called the Walking Death, had tears in his eyes because of a 8-pound baby who had screamed through his own arrival into the world, as if protesting the terms of the agreement. Hey, he said to his son, quietly, like they were being formally introduced. Raphael stopped crying. I had to bite down hard on my lip to keep from completely falling apart. The next 3 months turned my life upside down in the best possible way. Klaus would wake up at night when Raphael cried before I even got up. He'd come back to bed with the baby against his chest, lean against the headboard, and just sit there in the dark, humming something. A tuneless melody he swore wasn't a lullaby, just a sound, and which Raphael listened to with the solemn concentration of a baby who seemed to be politely playing along with the lie. I'd pretend to be asleep. I'd watch them through half-closed eyes. This is what I will never give up, I'd think. This, exactly this. During the day, Klaus was what he'd always been, the gravitational center of a world that revolved around loyalty, power, and threats I preferred not to discuss over dinner. Meetings, phone calls, men who appeared and disappeared, Drago always nearby, always watchful, always with that guard dog expression he'd extended to include me and Raphael as part of the territory he protected. But at home, in the few hours that were ours, Klaus was just my husband, the man who stole pieces of my breakfast without asking, who knew exactly how I liked my coffee before I said anything, who put his hand on my waist every single time he walked past me in the kitchen, always, without fail, like an involuntary reflex, as if he simply couldn't pass close to me without touching. I'd stopped noticing. It had become part of the routine, part of the air. That's always how it is, I think. We stopped noticing the exact things we can't afford to lose. Raphael had just turned 3 months and 2 days old when Klaus was shot. It was an ordinary Tuesday. I was nursing the baby near the bedroom window. that late afternoon light coming in gold between the curtains. Raphael completely focused on the task at hand, me completely focused on him. When he did it, the smile, his first real smile, gummy, uncoordinated, completely lacking in aesthetic purpose, and absolutely the most beautiful thing I had ever seen in my life. I laughed, quietly so I wouldn't startle him. "Look at you," I whispered. "Look what you just did." My phone rang. I answered without checking the number. "Mrs. Morrow." Drago's voice. Drago, who never called my cell phone. Drago, who had a protocol for everything and who, for the first time in 2 years, sounded like a man who didn't know how to arrange his words. "We need you to come to St. Luke's." The boss. A pause that lasted less than a second but weighed a lifetime. "He's been hit." Raphael was still smiling. I couldn't breathe. The shot had been surgical. Not a stray bullet, not an accident. A planned execution. Sniper, 300 yards out, timed for the exact moment Klaus stepped out of the car in front of the warehouse he used for private meetings. The security route had been leaked from the inside. Someone had passed it along. Klaus survived because Drago threw his body over him the instant the shot rang out, and the bullet meant for his heart had deflected 2 inches to the right. 2 inches. But he'd hit the base of his skull on the fall. Severe traumatic brain injury. Medically induced coma to protect the brain. Prognosis. Wait and see. I remember signing papers, calling Klaus's mother, nursing Raphael in the waiting room corridor because the baby needed to eat, and the world doesn't stop even when it should. I remember Donna Sonia, the night nurse who'd adopted us both without being asked, bringing me a wool blanket and telling me I could stay as long as I needed. I don't remember crying. I think the crying came later, when it became too real to hold back. 6 months. 6 months of uncomfortable chairs and antiseptic and a heart monitor beeping in the rhythm of a countdown I'd stopped counting. 6 months of Raphael growing without his father, learning to sit up, learning to laugh again, that new baby laugh that had become my anchor, while Klaus lay motionless in that bed with tubes in his arm and machines breathing for him. I talked to him. Every day. Mostly small things. I'd tell him what Raphael had done, complain about traffic, describe whatever I'd made for dinner as if he could weigh in. Once I spent 20 minutes recapping a terrible TV episode I'd watched alone just because I needed to talk to someone I knew wouldn't interrupt me. Then I felt awful about it and apologized out loud. "Wake up," I told him every time before leaving. "You have a son who's growing too fast, and I'm getting very good at doing your intimidating face, and that's not healthy for either of us." He didn't wake up. It was on one of those afternoons. Raphael asleep in the portable bassinet in the corner, me holding Klaus's hand with my eyes closed, trying to convince my own heart to be patient, that I felt it. The weight of someone's eyes. Someone was watching me from the doorway. I opened my eyes slowly. I caught the reflection in the window glass first. Tall, broad shoulders, dark blazer, hair slightly silver at the temples. Still, watching. I stood up, turned slowly. The man in the doorway had my husband's eyes. Dark brown, weighted like someone who'd been carrying things for too long. But the mouth was different. The posture was different. He was Klaus, and he wasn't Klaus. Like the echo of someone familiar coming from a place I didn't know. "You must be Livia," he said. Not a question. And I understood before he even said the name that my life, which had already been turned upside down once, was about to be turned again. "Nico Morrow," he said. Klaus's brother. The brother who disappeared. The brother who came back. I looked at my husband. Motionless in the bed. You could really wake up right now, I thought. This would be an excellent time. He didn't wake up. The Morrow estate sat 12 miles outside the city, behind iron gates that didn't open for anyone who wasn't expected and didn't apologize for it. I'd been here twice before. Both times with Klaus, both times briefly. Both times with the distinct sensation of being a guest in a house that was still deciding whether it liked me. The main building was Georgian, 3 stories. White stone that had probably been beautiful once and was now merely imposing. The grounds were immaculate in the way that suggested the landscaping crew worked out of obligation, rather than love. It looked exactly like what it was. A fortress dressed up as a home. Drago drove. I sat in the back with Raphael in his car seat, one hand resting on the buckle out of habit, watching the gate close behind us in the rearview mirror. It made a sound like a period at the end of a sentence. Nico was waiting on the front steps. He had his hands in his pockets and the look of a man who had been awake since before the sun came up, which I noted with zero sympathy, because so had I, because his arrival was directly responsible for that particular fact. There was coffee in his hand. He walked to the car before Drago had fully stopped. He opened my door. I looked at him. He looked at me. "There's a room set up for the baby," he said. "Adjoining yours. I had the staff move a crib in last night." I unbuckled Raphael's car seat without responding, which was not agreement but which was also not argument, and which seemed to be the most I could manage before coffee. As if reading that thought with irritating accuracy, Nico reached back and produced a second cup from the step railing where he'd left it. I stopped. "How do you take it?" he asked, and before I could answer, "Black, 2 sugars," Drago told me. I took the cup. Our fingers didn't touch. I made sure of that. "Thank you," I said, because my mother raised me right even when I didn't want to be. Nico nodded once and stepped aside to let me pass. The room they'd prepared for me was on the 2nd floor, east wing, with a window that faced the garden. It was not the room Klaus and I had stayed in during our 2 previous visits. That one was in the west wing, larger, with the kind of closet that had its own lighting system. This one was smaller. Deliberate, I thought. A guest room, not a family room. A reminder, subtle as a closed door, that my status here was provisional. I set Raphael down in the crib, which was new, still had the faint smell of the store, and stood at the window with my coffee and looked at the garden for a long moment. "You're in a mafia estate with your 9-month-old son and your husband's estranged brother," I told myself, "who you have known for approximately 14 hours, who brought you coffee, which is not a personality, Livia. Lots of people bring coffee. Serial killers probably bring coffee." Raphael made a sound in the crib, the happy kind. He'd found his own feet again, which was apparently still the funniest discovery of his life, every single time. I breathed out slowly. Okay, I thought. Figure out what's happening, then figure out everything else. Nico was in the study when I came back downstairs. It was a large room, dark wood, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, a desk that had probably heard more dangerous conversations than most courtrooms. He was standing at the window with his back to me, phone to his ear, speaking in a low voice that stopped the moment I pushed the door open. He turned, looked at me, said into the phone, "I'll call you back," and hung up without waiting for an answer. I chose the chair across from the desk, deliberately not the smaller one near the door, the one that said "I know my place here." The one directly across the desk said something else entirely. By the slight shift in his expression when he sat down, he noticed. "Good. Tell me about the men in the photo," I said. Nico set a folder on the desk between us. I opened it. 3 photographs, printed sharp. 2 men I didn't recognize, 1 I did. Not personally, but I'd seen his face in documents Klaus had left on the desk once. Documents I wasn't supposed to see. Documents about a family called the Vance Group that had gone dark 18 months ago after a territory dispute that Klaus had never fully explained to me. "Victor Hale," Nico said, tapping the familiar face. "Enforcer. He worked for the Vance family until they dissolved. After that, he went freelance." A pause. "He was photographed outside St. Luke's 3 times in the last 2 weeks." 3 times, I repeated. The first time was 2 days after Klaus was admitted. The coffee turned cold in my hands. "Someone hired him to finish the job," I said. It wasn't a question. "Someone hired him to make sure Klaus doesn't wake up." Nico's voice stayed even. "And to remove anything, or anyone, that might complicate the transition of the family's operations." The word "anyone" sat between us like something with teeth. "You mean me," I said. "I mean you. And Raphael." I set the coffee down carefully, very carefully, because my hands, if I wasn't deliberate about it, were going to shake, and I wasn't going to give this room the satisfaction. "Who inside the family?" I said. Nico looked at me steadily. "That's what I'm trying to find out. Do you have a suspect?" "I have 4. He leaned back, which is the same as having none, until I can narrow it down. The meeting was interrupted 40 minutes in by raised voices in the hallway. I recognized one of them immediately. Margaret Morrow, Klaus's mother, a woman who had the bearing of a retired queen and the warmth of a February morning in Chicago. She'd been civil to me during the marriage. Never more than that. I understood it. I was the woman her son had chosen over the family's preferred candidate, and Margaret Morrow was not a woman who forgot the original plan. The door opened without a knock. She walked in, looked at me seated across from her son, and produced a smile that was technically a smile in the way that a closed fist is technically a hand. "Livia," she said, "I wasn't aware you'd be joining this meeting." "She's not joining it," Nico said without looking up from the folder. "She's running it with me." Silence. Margaret's smile didn't move. which was somehow worse than if it had. Nico, darling, there are matters of family operation that are directly relevant to her safety and the safety of her son. Now he looked up. Which makes them her business. A beat. Sit down, mother, or wait outside, but don't walk in here and make her feel like a guest in her own family's house. I kept my face neutral through an act of personal heroism. Margaret looked at her son for a long moment. Then she looked at me. Something passed through her expression that I couldn't fully read. Not quite respect, not quite surrender, but something that had moved a fraction of an inch in that direction. She sat down. By evening, I had a security detail, a revised daily schedule, and a headache that started behind my left eye and was clearly planning a long stay. I was in the kitchen, because I couldn't sleep and because the kitchen in this house was the one room that felt like it might have been touched by actual human beings, making tea I didn't particularly want, when I heard the door. Nico, in a t-shirt this time, which was a different kind of information than the blazer. There was a tattoo on his forearm, partial, disappearing under the sleeve, and I made a point of not looking at it for more than 1 second. He didn't say anything. He went to the refrigerator, looked inside in that way men do when they're not actually hungry but need something to do with their hands, and then closed it without taking anything. You handled her well today, he said, meaning his mother. I didn't handle anything. You did. I gave you the room. You kept it. I turned to face him. He was leaning against the counter with his arms crossed, and in the low light of the kitchen he looked less like a stone wall and more like a man who was tired. Really tired. The kind that sleep doesn't fix. Why did you come back? I asked. He didn't answer immediately. Klaus called me, he said finally. 6 weeks before the shooting, he said. A pause. He said he thought something was building, that he might need backup he could trust completely. My chest tightened. He didn't tell me. He didn't want to worry you. Raphael was small. You'd just started sleeping again. Something flickered in his expression. He talked about you a lot in that call, more than I expected. What did he say? Nico looked at me for a moment, then quietly, that you were the first person he'd ever been afraid to lose. The kitchen was very still. I looked down at my tea, swallowed. Don't, I told myself, don't you dare fall apart in front of this man. He should have told me, I said. My voice held. Barely. Yes, Nico said simply. He should have. We stood there in the silence for a moment that lasted longer than it should have. He didn't fill it with reassurances or practiced condolences or any of the things people usually reach for. He just let it be what it was. It was, infuriatingly, exactly the right thing to do. I was almost at the door when he said my name. Livia. I turned. He hadn't moved from the counter. His expression was unreadable in the way it almost always was, but there was something underneath it, something careful and deliberate, like a man choosing each word the way you choose your footing on uneven ground. You're safe here, he said. I know you don't trust me yet. I'm not asking you to. A pause. But you're safe, both of you. That's not a promise I make easily. I studied him for a moment. I know, I said. And the unsettling thing, the thing I carried up the stairs and into the dark of my room and did not examine too closely, was that I meant it. Double hook. End of chapter 2. Danger hook. At 2:14 a.m., Drago knocked on Nico's door with a single piece of information. Victor Hale had been found dead in a parking garage 3 miles from the estate. Clean shot, professional, which meant 2 things. Someone was tying up loose ends, and whoever had hired him was still inside their circle, still watching, and had just made their first move to stay invisible permanently. Romantic tension. Livia lay in the dark, listening to Raphael breathe from the next room, replaying the kitchen, the way Nico had said the first person he'd ever been afraid to lose, and realized she was less angry than she should have been, less guarded. She pressed her hand flat against the mattress and thought about her husband in a hospital bed 12 miles away, and she thought about dark eyes in a quiet kitchen, and she hated herself a little for the fact that the 2 thoughts had arrived in the same breath. He's his brother, she told herself. He's exactly his brother, that's the problem. The call came at 7 in the morning while I was feeding Raphael oatmeal. He kept spitting back at me with the focused enthusiasm of someone who had strong opinions about breakfast. Nico walked into the kitchen already on the phone, already dressed, already carrying the particular quality of stillness that I'd learned in 48 hours, meant something had gone wrong. He looked at me once, a quick assessing look, the kind that checks for damage before checking for details, and then turned slightly away and kept talking in a voice too low to catch. I wiped oatmeal off my collarbone and waited. He hung up. stood for a moment with his back to me. "There was a breach in the security system last night," he said, "between 2 and 4 a.m. Someone accessed the estate's external camera feed remotely. They were inside the network for 11 minutes before Drago's team caught it." I set the spoon down. "They were watching the house. They were mapping it." He turned. "Entry points, patrol rotations, blind spots." A pause that felt deliberate. "They know you're here." Raphael chose that exact moment to slap both hands into his oatmeal bowl with the triumphant energy of someone who had been waiting for an opening. The bowl flipped. Oatmeal went across the tray, across the high chair, across a significant portion of the kitchen floor, and across the front of Nico's shirt. Silence. Nico looked down at his shirt. Raphael looked up at Nico with the serene expression of a baby who had absolutely no regrets. "I'm so sorry," I said, standing quickly, grabbing a dish towel. "He does that when— Here, let me—" "It's fine." But he took the towel when I held it out, and for half a second our hands were both on it at the same time, and I let go faster than necessary. "He likes you," I said, because Raphael was now making his reaching sound, that particular grabby hands noise he reserved for things he found genuinely interesting. "That's actually a good sign." He threw a wooden block at Drago on day one. Something shifted at the corner of Nico's mouth. Not quite a smile. The preliminary architecture of one. "I'll take it," he said. The plan, as Nico laid it out an hour later, was to move me and Raphael to a secondary location, a property the family held in the hills, 30 minutes out, registered under a name with no Morrow connection, while his team swept the estate and traced the network breach. "How long?" I asked. 2 days. Maybe 3. I need to see Klaus." "I know. We'll route through the hospital on the way. 30 minutes, no more. And not in your usual car." I nodded. "Then, I want to know everything your team finds about the breach, in real time. Not summaries, not filtered reports." Nico looked at me for a moment. "Agreed. And I want Drago with me at the secondary location." "He'll be there." "Then I need 40 minutes to pack for a baby, which is a logistical operation that makes military deployment look relaxed. So I'd appreciate it if everyone stayed out of my way." Nico stepped aside from the doorway without a word. I caught as I passed the fractional lift of his chin that I was beginning to recognize as his version of being impressed. I didn't let myself feel good about it. Much. St. Luke's was quiet at mid-morning. We went in through the staff entrance. Me, Nico, Drago, and a security arrangement that made it look like a small, very well-dressed invasion. Raphael was in the carrier against my chest, head tucked under my chin, apparently deciding that today was a good day to be cooperative about being transported. I held the back of his head the way I always did and tried to breathe normally. Klaus's room was the same as it always was, the same machines, the same smell of antiseptic and recycled air, the same quality of stillness that I had never made peace with, that particular silence of a person who is present but unreachable, as if they've stepped just far enough behind a door that you can still see the shadow of their feet underneath it. I sat beside him, held his hand, talked in the low, steady voice I used here, different from my regular voice, slower, like I was leaving space for him to respond. "Raphael learned how to get oatmeal to hit a target at maximum distance," I told him. "He demonstrated this morning. His aim is remarkable. I think you'd be proud and also horrified, which is your general reaction to most things he does, from what I can tell." Behind me, near the door, I heard Nico very quietly move to let Drago step out into the hallway with Raphael so I could have a minute. I hadn't asked for that. I hadn't needed to. I held Klaus's hand tighter and dropped my voice. "There are people trying to get to us," I said quietly. "Your brother is here." "I know. I know you two have a history I don't fully understand, and I know you'd probably want to be the one to decide how much I trust him. But you're not here to decide that right now." A pause. "So I'm deciding. And I think he's doing this for the right reasons." I pressed my lips together. "Wake up soon, because there's a lot happening that I can handle, and there's one thing I refuse to handle indefinitely, and that's sleeping in a house with a man who has your eyes." I stood up, pressed a hand briefly to his cheek. "Wake up," I said. "We need you home." We were 40 minutes outside the city when it happened. Nico was driving. He'd taken the wheel himself at the last minute, which Drago had not argued with in a way that told me this was an established dynamic. I was in the passenger seat. Drago was in the back with Raphael, who had taken a profound liking to Drago's watch and was conducting a detailed investigation of its clasp. I was watching the road and not watching Nico and managing both with moderate success when he said quietly, "Get down." Not loudly, not with alarm, the way you'd say watch your step, calm, precise, entirely matter-of-fact, which made it worse. What? Black SUV. 2 cars back, it's been with us since the hospital. His eyes stayed on the rearview mirror. Drago. I see it, Drago said from the back seat, and his voice had changed entirely, flattened into something operational, all the human texture stripped out. Secondary vehicle merging from the east ramp. 2 of them, Nico said. Raphael, I started. Drago has him. Nico's hand found my shoulder and pressed, brief and firm, pushing me lower in the seat. Stay down. I need you to stay down and trust me for the next 4 minutes. 4 minutes? I repeated. Approximately. That's a very specific. He turned hard right onto an exit that wasn't on any GPS route, and the force of it pressed me sideways into the console, and his right arm came across. Instinct. Pure reflex. Bracing across my collarbone before I could register the motion. The car straightened. His arm didn't move for 1 second too long. Then he pulled it back. Eyes on the road. Expression unchanged. Neither of us said anything. From the back seat, I heard Raphael make a sound of mild inconvenience, as if the whole maneuver had been personally directed at him. The next 3 minutes were the most controlled chaos I'd experienced since labor. 2 vehicles behind us, both maintaining distance but not backing off. Nico navigating a route that clearly existed in his head and nowhere else. Back roads, service lanes, a stretch through what appeared to be a commercial loading zone that made me briefly fear for the undercarriage of the car. He drove the way he talked, without waste, without theater, with a competence so complete it left no room for doubt. I twisted to check Raphael. He was in his seat, entirely unimpressed, conducting further research on Drago's watch. Clear on the left, Drago said. 1 still holding, Nico said. License plate is false. Already running it. He glanced in the mirror again, then at me for half a second. You're doing well. I'm sitting in a car. You're sitting in a car without telling me how to drive, which I appreciate more than you know. Under different circumstances, I might have laughed. He took a final turn onto an unmarked road that ran along the back of what looked like an industrial park, held steady at 60 for 90 seconds, and then said simply, lost them. Silence. Then Drago. Confirmed. Clear. I exhaled. It came out longer than I expected, which was embarrassing, and I turned to look out the side window so neither of them would see my hands press flat against my thighs to stop the trembling that had been waiting politely to start. I managed exactly 4 seconds before Nico said without looking at me, shaking is normal. It means your body was paying attention. I'm not shaking. Okay. I'm not. I believe you. He said it with such perfect evenness that I couldn't tell if he was humoring me or actually convinced, and I decided it didn't matter, and looked back out the window. The secondary location was a low stone house at the edge of a wooded hill, surrounded by enough tree cover to make it invisible from the road, and enough sight lines from the inside to see anyone approaching from 3 directions. Someone had stocked the kitchen recently. I could tell by the milk that wasn't expired and the fruit bowl that still had grapes. I put Raphael down for his nap while Drago did a perimeter check and Nico set up in the small room off the kitchen that had clearly been used as a command space before, judging by the portable monitors someone had already installed. When I came back downstairs, he was at the table with 3 phones, a laptop, and the concentrated expression of a man dismantling a problem from the inside. I made coffee, set a cup beside his laptop without saying anything, started to move away. Livia. His voice stopped me. I turned. He was looking at the cup, then at me with an expression I didn't have a name for yet. Thank you. You brought me coffee this morning, I said. I'm returning the gesture. You don't have to keep score. I'm not keeping score, I'm maintaining equilibrium. They're different things. He studied me for a moment. Are they? In my experience, yes. He nodded once, slowly, and looked back at the laptop. I was almost out of the room when he spoke again, quieter this time. The arm, he said. In the car. I apologize if that was... It wasn't, I said. Too quickly. I kept walking. That night, after Raphael was asleep and the house had settled into the specific silence of a place surrounded by security that you hope is adequate, I sat on the floor of my room with my back against the bed and did the thing I'd been avoiding. Let myself think. He had Klaus's eyes and not Klaus's voice and not Klaus's way of being in a room. Klaus filled space like a weather system. You always knew where he was. You always felt the pressure change. Nico did the opposite. He made himself smaller than his size, quieter than his presence, and somehow that was more dangerous because you didn't know he was close until he already was. The arm in the car had lasted 3 seconds. I'd counted. 3 seconds is not a long time. 3 seconds is how long it takes to pour a glass of water, to tie a shoelace, to read a short sentence. 3 seconds is nothing. Stop counting seconds, I told myself. Your husband is in a hospital bed. Someone is trying to kill your family. You have a 9-month-old asleep 20 feet away. You have exactly 0 room in your life for whatever this is. And whatever this is nothing. And you are going to go to sleep now. I went to sleep. It took a long time. I found out about the hospital breach the way I found out about most things in this house. Not because someone told me, but because I walked into a room at the wrong moment and read the room correctly. Or the right moment, depending on your perspective. Nico was at the kitchen table at 6 a.m. with Drago and a man I didn't recognize. 3 laptops open between them and the specific quality of tension in the air that meant the conversation had been going for hours and hadn't arrived anywhere good. He looked up when I came in. The other man started to close one of the laptops. "Don't," I said. The man looked at Nico. Nico said nothing for a moment. Then, "Leave it." I poured coffee, sat down, looked at the screen that was still open. A hospital floor plan, East Wing, 3rd floor, with a red marker pulsing over a room that was not Klaus's room but was 30 feet from it. I looked at it long enough to understand what I was looking at. Then I looked at Nico. "When?" I said. "Sometime between 11 p.m. and 2 a.m. The device in the hospital. Do you know whose it is?" "We're narrowing it down." A pause. "It's registered to a staff member. Orderly. But the access pattern doesn't match his shift. Someone used his device without him knowing. Or he's been compromised and doesn't realize the extent of it yet." Nico's jaw was tight. "Either way, we've already contacted the hospital's security director. Klaus's room has been moved. New floor, new wing, access restricted to 3 names. He looked at me. "Yours is one of them." I wrapped both hands around the coffee mug. They were 30 feet from him, I thought. 30 feet in the middle of the night, and he can't move and he can't call for help and he doesn't even know. "I need to see him today," I said. "I know. We go at noon. Different route, different vehicle." He held my gaze. "I won't let anything happen to him." It was said simply, not as a reassurance, as a statement of fact the way you'd say the sun rises east. But underneath the evenness of it I heard something else. Something that didn't belong in a tactical briefing. Something that was older and rawer than strategy. I didn't push on it. Not yet. We reached the hospital without incident. The new room was smaller and had no window, which bothered me in a way I couldn't entirely justify. Klaus had always been particular about light. He opened every curtain in every room he entered so automatically that I don't think he was even aware he did it. A room without windows felt like an indignity. I sat beside him and held his hand and talked, same as always. Told him about the hill house, the stone walls, the grapes in the fruit bowl that Raphael had attempted to eat whole and been gently redirected. I told him the route Nico had taken the day before, through the loading zone, and said that his brother drove like someone who had made a personal enemy of the concept of a direct path. Behind me, near the door, I heard the specific quality of silence that meant Nico was listening. I didn't change what I was saying. When I stood to leave, I pressed my hand to Klaus's cheek the way I always did. The machines kept their rhythm. The room kept its stillness. And I stood there for one extra moment, just breathing, just being close enough to feel that he was warm and present and still here. Still here, even if here was this insufficient room with no windows and fluorescent light, and me trying to hold an entire world together with both hands. "I've got him," I said quietly, meaning Raphael, meaning everything. I turned to find Nico watching me with an expression I'd never seen on his face before. It was gone in a second, but I'd seen it. The vulnerability cracked open that night. Not dramatically, not the way things crack in movies with raised voices and weather. It happened quietly, the way real things usually do. In the kitchen, past midnight, over reheated food neither of us was particularly interested in. I couldn't sleep. Raphael had been restless, teething probably the particular misery of new teeth arriving uninvited, and I'd been up with him for 2 hours before he finally settled. I came downstairs to find Nico at the kitchen table, but not working this time, just sitting, both hands flat on the table, looking at nothing specific, in the posture of a man who had put down something heavy and hadn't yet decided whether to pick it back up. He heard me come in. Didn't straighten. I heated up what was left of the soup Drago had made earlier, poured 2 bowls without asking, and set one in front of him. Sat across the table. We ate in silence for a while. Then he said without preamble, "I left because he asked me to." I looked up. His eyes were on the bowl. "Klaus, when I disappeared, when everyone assumed I'd broken from the family over some conflict, some power dispute, whatever version of the story made the rounds, it was because he told me to go." A pause. There was a situation, a threat from inside that he couldn't prove yet. He believed, that if I was visibly gone, removed from the equation, the people moving against him would show their hand faster. The muscle in his jaw worked once. He said it would take 6 months at most. "That was 3 years ago," I said. "Yes." I set my spoon down. "You stayed away for 3 years because he asked you to." He stopped asking me to come back. Nico finally looked up. Every time I reached out, the answer was not yet. The threat evolved. The timeline moved. Something tightened in his expression. I let it. I told myself it was strategy, that it was what he needed. A pause that held more weight than most speeches. I was wrong. The kitchen was very quiet. "He called you 6 weeks before the shooting," I said carefully. "He told you something was building." "He called me because he finally ran out of not yet." Nico's voice stayed even, but underneath it was something controlled by effort rather than nature. "He called me because he needed me, and he'd spent 3 years deciding whether he was allowed to need me, and by the time he decided, by the time he actually picked up the phone, he stopped. I was 6 hours away. I was on a plane the same night he called, and I was still too late. I didn't say anything. There was nothing to say that wouldn't diminish it." He looked at his hands. "I have spent the last 6 months thinking about those 6 hours. There it is," I thought. "There's the thing no one else sees. This is not a man running an operation. This is a man punishing himself for 6 hours every single day and building walls around it so no one can tell." The internal monologue I'd been keeping at arm's length for 3 days came in all at once whether I wanted it to or not. He's carrying guilt the same way you're carrying fear, I thought. You recognize it because it's the same weight, just a different shape. And you could sit across this table and treat him like a problem to be managed, or you could be honest and acknowledge that the two of you are both, in completely different ways, absolutely devastated by the same man being in that hospital bed. But one of those options is safe and one of them isn't, and you already know which is which. I folded my hands on the table. "He talks about you," I said. Talks. I corrected myself. Present tense. He still does, just more quietly now. I kept my voice level. "He never told me the specifics of why you left, but he kept a photograph of the two of you in his desk drawer. Second drawer, left side. He never mentioned it, but he never moved it either." I paused. "That's not a man who stopped needing his brother. That's a man who didn't know how to say come back." Nico was very still. "He used to say," I continued, "that the people worth trusting were the ones who stayed when you gave them every reason to leave." I met his eyes. "You came back when he called. After 3 years of not yet, you were on a plane the same night." I held his gaze. "That counts, Nico." The silence afterward was different from the silences before. Less like distance, more like something that had been under pressure for a long time, releasing very slowly into the air. "You're easier to talk to than I expected," he said finally. "People usually mean that as a compliment, but it's actually a result of very exhausting work." The corner of his mouth lifted. This time it completed the journey. A full half-smile, brief and unguarded, there and gone before he seemed to realize he'd allowed it. It was the first time I'd seen him look like Klaus. It was the first time I'd seen him look entirely like himself. "Don't," I thought immediately. "Whatever your pulse is doing right now, stop." I picked up my spoon. "Eat your soup," I said. "It's getting cold." He looked at me for a moment with an expression I refused to examine. Then he picked up his spoon. Later, much later, lying in the dark, listening to Raphael breathe his slow, peaceful baby breaths, I pressed the back of my hand to my mouth and stared at the ceiling, and had the conversation with myself that I'd been postponing. You are not falling for him. You are lonely and scared, and the person you love most in the world is 12 miles away and unreachable. And this man has his eyes and his voice's lower register, and he looks at you like you are a problem he is slowly deciding he doesn't want to solve. You are in proximity. You are in crisis. These are the worst possible conditions for making any kind of emotional assessment about anything. He is your husband's brother. That sentence alone should be sufficient. It is sufficient. It is. I turned onto my side and looked at the wall. It's sufficient, I told myself again. The ceiling didn't confirm or deny. The name came through on a Thursday morning, and it broke everything open. Nico was at the command table when I came downstairs, and I knew before he turned around that whatever he'd found had changed the shape of the problem. There's a specific quality to the stillness of a man who has just confirmed his worst theory. Not shock, not anger. Something colder than both. The particular flatness of someone who had prepared for a terrible answer and received it anyway. "Tell me," I said. He turned, looked at me for a moment. Then he said the name. Warren Morrow. I knew the name. Claus's first cousin. 41 years old, head of the family's Eastern operations. Present at every major gathering I'd attended since the wedding. A man I'd found unremarkable in the specific way of someone who works hard at being unremarkable. "He's the one who passed the route," Nico said. "The night of the shooting. He was the only one outside Drago's inner circle who had access to the updated security schedule, and he transmitted it through an encrypted channel we traced back to a Vance family contact. The Vance family is dissolved. Their money isn't." He set a folder on the table. I opened it. Financial records, routing numbers, a chain of shell companies that ended at a single account, holding more money than I had reference points for. Warren has been systematically redirecting family revenue for 2 years. Small enough amounts that the quarterly audits missed it, large enough that over 24 months it built something significant. A pause. He funded the hit. He fed the root. And when Claus didn't die, he hired Victor Hale to finish it, and then had Hale killed to close the thread. I closed the folder. My hands were steady. I was distantly proud of that. "He was at the hospital," I said. "He came to see Claus twice in the first month. I was there for one of those visits." "I know." "He held my son." My voice stayed even through an act of pure will. "He sat in that room and held Raphael, and told me Claus was going to be fine." "I know," Nico said again, quietly. The rage came in slow and total, like water filling a room. Not hot, not explosive, just steady and rising and thorough. I pressed both palms flat on the table and breathed through it. "What happens now?" I said. "We move carefully. Warren doesn't know we've identified him. If we do this wrong, he disappears, burns the evidence, and we lose everything." Nico's voice was measured, tactical, completely controlled. "I need 48 hours to position correctly. And in 48 hours? He answers for it." The certainty in those 4 words was not a threat. It was simply a fact. The same way gravity is a fact. Not argued, not performed, just true. "What do you need from me?" I asked. He looked at me, and in his expression was something I recognized from the kitchen 3 nights ago. That fractional softening, there and gone, like a door opened briefly into a room with more light. "Stay in the house," he said. "Keep Raphael close. And trust me for 48 more hours." "I already trust you," I said. I didn't mean to say it that directly. Neither of us moved. "I know," he said, differently than he'd said it before. The 48 hours compressed into something that felt simultaneously endless and terrifyingly fast. Nico barely slept. I knew this because I barely slept either, and the light under the command room door was present every time I passed in the night with Raphael, who had decided this was an excellent week to work on his teeth with maximum inconvenience to everyone. On the second night, I made coffee without thinking and brought a cup to the command room door and knocked once. He opened it after a moment, took the cup, looked at me in the hallway in my sleep clothes, hair down, Raphael on my hip gnawing a cold teething ring with grim determination. "You should be sleeping," he said. Fascinating theory. He looked at Raphael, then at me, and in the tired lines of his face, in the particular way the late hour stripped the control back to something more honest. I saw it clearly for the first time. Not just the guilt he carried, not just the discipline, but the loneliness. Enormous and long-standing. The kind that becomes so familiar a person stops registering it as something that could change. He's been alone for 3 years, I thought, by his own choice, and by Klaus's request, and by the particular cruelty of loving people you're required to stay away from. "Come in," he said. "You don't have to stand in the hallway." I came in, sat in the chair in the corner, the one that wasn't in front of a monitor, the one that was just a chair, and held Raphael against my chest while he fought his teeth and the night and everything. Nico went back to the monitors. Didn't talk, didn't perform any version of company, just let us be there. Raphael fell asleep in 20 minutes. The same way he'd fallen asleep to Klaus's tuneless humming in those early months. Like the presence of a certain kind of person was its own frequency, its own settling weight. I looked at my son's sleeping face and felt something pull so hard in my chest that I had to look away. He's not his father, I told myself. He is not a replacement. He is not a substitute. He is not a comfort prize the universe is offering you while the real thing is in a hospital bed 12 miles away. He is a man in a separate context who happens to be made of some of the same material, and you are going to stop constructing narratives about frequencies and settling weights right now. Right now, Livia. Now. You're arguing with yourself, Nico said, without turning from the monitor. I looked up. Excuse me? You get a specific look when you're having a conversation in your head that isn't going your way. He turned then, and the faint tiredness around his eyes didn't reach his mouth, which had the ghost of that half-smile again. Klaus does the same thing. Did. He paused. Does. The correction hung in the air. Present tense, I said, same as I'd said it to him 3 nights ago. Present tense, he agreed. The strike came the next evening without warning. Not from Warren, from someone Warren had sent, which was almost worse because it meant he knew somehow that the walls were closing, and he'd decided to move first. We were in the garden. It was my fault. I'd pushed for 20 minutes of outside air for Raphael because 4 days inside, a stone house was making us both slightly insane, and Nico had agreed with the kind of reluctant precision that said I have assessed this risk and find it acceptable for a brief controlled window. Drago was on the perimeter. 2 additional men on the tree line. Every reasonable precaution taken. Raphael was standing. He'd recently discovered that legs existed and were personally his, holding onto the low garden wall with both hands and exercising them with the focused joy of someone who had unlocked a new skill. I was crouched 2 feet away, hands out, waiting for the inevitable ambitious step that would exceed his current architecture. Nico was standing 6 feet back, watching the tree line with the peripheral attention that seemed to be his default state. The first shot hit the stone wall 18 inches to my left. The sound came a half second after the impact, and by then Nico was already moving, not away, toward, closing the 6 feet between us in a motion so fast and so total that I registered it only as sudden darkness, sudden solidity, the whole weight of him folding over me and Raphael as he took us both down behind the wall. Raphael, to his absolute credit, did not cry. He made a sound of profound indignation, as if being suddenly horizontal was a personal affront. Nico had one arm around both of us, his hand braced against the back of Raphael's head, my face pressed against his chest, the wall at our backs. I could feel his heartbeat, fast but controlled, the rhythm of a man whose body was afraid and whose mind was working anyway. 1 shooter, he said, low, into my hair. East tree line, elevated position. Drago's already moving. His arm tightened fractionally. Don't move from this wall until I say. I nodded against his chest, felt the motion of it. We were completely still for 30 seconds. Raphael had found a button on Nico's shirt and was investigating it with both hands, apparently deciding the current situation was acceptable if there were buttons. Then Drago's voice came through the earpiece Nico wore. Shooter down. Perimeter secure. We have a second man in custody. Nico exhaled. It was slow and long, and contained several days' worth of tension. He didn't move immediately. Neither did I. We stayed behind that wall for 3 additional seconds that had nothing to do with threat assessment, and everything to do with the fact that his arm was still around me, and Raphael was still between us, and the 3 of us were pressed together in the particular intimacy of people who have just been very afraid and are now, momentarily, safe. I became aware of several things at once. His hand still curved around the back of Raphael's head, his chin resting briefly against my hair, the way his heartbeat was slowing under my palm, which was somehow still pressed flat against his chest. I lifted my head. He looked down. We were close. Too close for any interpretation that didn't require honesty. Close enough that I could see the exact shade of brown in his eyes, darker at the edges, lighter at the center, and the particular set of his expression, which wasn't careful anymore, which wasn't controlled, which was for one exposed moment simply a man looking at a woman and not being able to put the wall back up fast enough. I watched him notice that I'd noticed. I watched him try to decide what to do about it. Raphael solved it by grabbing a fistful of Nico's shirt and pulling with surprising conviction, and the spell broke cleanly, and we both leaned back, and Nico stood and reached down and helped me up in one motion, and his hand let go of mine the moment I was steady. We need to go inside, he said. Yes, I agreed. We didn't look at each other again on the way in. The man in custody broke in under an hour. Warren had sent them, not to kill, not yet, to take. Raphael, specifically. Leverage in the oldest and ugliest sense to force the family to back down from whatever they discovered, and let Warren complete what he'd started with Claus's shooting. He was going to take my son. I sat with that for 10 minutes in the bathroom with the door locked and the tap running so no one could hear, and I let myself feel it completely. The terror, the fury, the specific grief of understanding exactly how much danger we'd been in, and for how long. I let myself shake. Let the tears come. Briefly. Efficiently. Without performance. Then I washed my face. Turned the tap off. Looked at myself in the mirror. You are okay, I told the woman looking back. Raphael is okay. It didn't happen. You are okay. I went back out. Nico was in the hallway. He'd been waiting, I realized. Not pacing. Not pretending to be doing something else. Just standing there waiting with the quiet patience of someone who understood that some things needed to happen privately and some things needed a witness ready on the other side. I stopped in front of him. Thank you, I said. In the garden. You don't. I do. I held his gaze. You covered us. Both of us. You didn't think about it, you just. I stopped. Steadied. Thank you. Nico looked at me with that expression I'd been refusing to name for 5 days. And for the first time he didn't pull it back. He let it stay on his face. Careful, weighted, complicated in ways that had no clean resolution. Livia, he said. Low. The way it sounded like something that could break. Don't, I said, not harshly, not as a rejection. As the last piece of a wall I was holding up with both hands and wasn't sure I could hold much longer. He understood. I saw it in the almost imperceptible close of his eyes, the breath he took, the way he nodded once. Not agreement, just acknowledgement, the particular dignity of a man who understood the difference between what was felt and what was possible. He stepped back. I walked past him, and I made it exactly to the end of the hallway before I had to stop and press my hand flat against the wall and remind myself, with everything I had, why almost was the only word that was allowed to live here. Almost was all it could be. Almost had to be enough. Margaret Morrow did not deny it. That was the thing I kept returning to afterward. Not the revelation itself, not the scale of it, but the particular quality of her silence. When Nico laid the evidence on the table in front of her. No outrage, no performance of innocence. She looked at the documents, looked at her son, and folded her hands in her lap with the composure of a woman who had been waiting for this room for a long time, and had decided, somewhere along the way, that she would meet it standing, or in this case, sitting, with perfect posture. Warren came to me, she said finally, not the other way around. I want that noted. Noted, Nico said. His voice was the flattest I had ever heard it. He had already set the machinery in motion before I knew. By the time he told me, a pause. Something moved across her face that might have been genuine and might have been performance, and I found I no longer had the capacity to determine which. Klaus was making decisions that were going to fracture the family. The territories, the restructuring, the people he was cutting loose. Warren believed it would destroy everything your father built. So you let him try to destroy Klaus instead, Nico said. I told Warren to stop. Her voice sharpened. When I found out the extent of it, the shooting, I told him it was finished, that we would find another way. And Victor Hale. A silence. I didn't know about Hale until after, she said. Warren acted alone on that. That distinction, Nico said, is going to matter very little in practice. Margaret looked at her son for a long moment. Then she looked at me. I had been sitting at the end of the table in a silence I'd chosen deliberately, and her gaze carried something I still couldn't fully name. Not quite an apology, not quite a plea, something suspended between the two. I never wished harm to you or the child, she said. I know, I said. That's the part that's going to take me the longest to work through. She nodded once, looked back at Nico. What happens now? She said. The same words I'd said to Nico days ago in the same kitchen, learning about Warren. The family resemblance, in that moment, was exact. Nico told her, I won't document the specifics. What I will say is that it was measured, and it was final, and it left no ambiguity about the distance between what the family had been and what it would be from this point forward. Warren would face consequences through channels that operated outside of courtrooms, but not outside of accountability. Margaret would step back from every operational role, permanently and without appeal. The house would be restructured. The family would continue. Klaus, when he woke, would have something left to come back to. When? I held on to that word with everything I had. He woke up on a Friday. Not gradually, not cinematically. The doctors had been cautioning me for weeks against expecting a dramatic awakening, and they were right too. It was a shift on a monitor first, a change in brain activity that the overnight nurse caught at 4 a.m. and called me about, with the specific, careful tone of medical professionals who have learned not to promise anything, but can't quite keep the hope out of their voice. I was in the car before she finished the sentence. Nico drove. He didn't ask if I wanted him to come. He was simply at the front door when I came down the stairs with Raphael in my arms, keys already in hand, and I looked at him in the low light of the entrance hall and felt a rush of gratitude so complete it had no edges. We didn't speak for most of the drive. Halfway there, his hand moved from the gear shift and rested briefly on the center console, not reaching for me, not making anything of it, just present, available, the way he'd been for days now, consistently and without requirement. I looked at it, then I put my hand over his. 3 seconds. Then I moved mine back. He kept his eyes on the road, but I saw his jaw release a tension I hadn't realized he'd been holding. Klaus was not fully conscious when I arrived, not in the movie sense. Eyes open, recognition immediate, meaningful first words. He was surfacing. That was the term the doctor used, and it was exactly right, like watching someone rise through deep water, the light reaching them in increments. I sat beside him, held his hand, talked in the low, steady voice I'd been training myself to keep level for 6 months. "Hey," I said. "There you are." His fingers moved, fractionally, against my palm. I pressed my lips together and held on. "Raphael is here," I said. "He can't come in yet. They won't let babies in intensive care, which is a policy I have several opinions about. But he's in the waiting room with—" I paused, steadied. "With your brother. He's safe. We're all safe." Klaus's eyes moved under their lids. "Take your time," I said. "We're not going anywhere." He was coherent by evening. Not fully. There were gaps, confusion, the disorientation of a man who had lost 6 months to a darkness he couldn't account for. But he knew my face. He knew my name. He held my hand with a grip that started weak and strengthened by the hour, as if he were testing the reality of me incrementally, making sure I stayed. I let him test it as many times as he needed. It was past 9 when Nico came in. I stood when I heard the door, and something happened in the room when the two brothers looked at each other for the first time in what was, in practical terms, 3 years and 6 months. I won't try to describe it fully because I don't think it belongs to me. What I'll say is that it was long, and it was unguarded in a way that neither of them was with anyone else, and at some point Klaus's free hand came up and Nico crossed the room and held it, and neither of them said anything for long enough that it became its own kind of language. Then Klaus looked at me with eyes that were tired and clear and entirely him. "You kept everything together," he said. His voice was rough from the tubes and the months of silence. "I had help," I said. He looked at his brother. Something passed between them. "I know," Klaus said. "The days after were not simple. Recovery is not a straight line. Klaus had good hours and hard ones. Days where he was nearly himself and days where the confusion returned and the frustration at his own limitations came out sideways. I held the line on those days the same way I'd held it for 6 months. Steady, patient, without pretending it wasn't hard. Nico remained at the estate. Operationally, there was still work to finish. Warren's situation to resolve, the family's restructuring to complete, the security architecture to rebuild correctly. Practically, there was no reason for him to leave yet. I told myself that was the only reason I was glad he was staying. I was getting worse at lying to myself. It was Klaus who named it. 11 days after he woke, sitting up in the hospital bed with more color in his face and the particular sharpness returning to his eyes that told me the man I knew was almost fully back, he looked at me for a long moment and said, "Tell me what happened. All of it. Not the security version." I told him. I took my time. I was honest about the fear, honest about the threat, honest about Margaret and Warren and the 48 hours that had preceded his waking up. I was honest about the garden, about the shot, about the wall and the 3 seconds afterward. I was honest about the kitchen at midnight and the coffee and what he'd said about the first person he'd ever been afraid to lose. Klaus was quiet through all of it. When I finished, he was looking at his hands. "He covered you," he said. "And Raphael." "Yes." Without thinking about it. "Yes." A long pause. "That's who he is," Klaus said. Not with bitterness, not with anything I could easily categorize. With the particular exhaustion of a man who understood something completely and was deciding how to carry it. That's always been who he is. He looked up at me. "And you." I held his gaze. "Klaus, I'm not asking you to confess anything," he said quietly. I'm not doing that." He reached for my hand. held it. I was gone for 6 months, Livia. You were alone and afraid, and someone who looked like me and acted like me and was made of the same things I'm made of was there. He pressed his thumb over my knuckles. I know who my brother is, and I know who you are. Nothing happened, I said. I know. He looked at me steadily. I also know what almost means. The room was very quiet. I almost let myself, I said. It was the first time I'd said it out loud to anyone, including myself. I chose not to. Klaus nodded once. His jaw was tight, but his eyes were clear. Why? Because you were still here, I said simply. You were 12 miles away in a hospital bed, and you were still more present in my life than anyone or anything else. Because every conversation I had, every decision I made, every time I said present tense, it was for you. I tightened my grip on his hand. Because I love you. That didn't go anywhere while you were gone. It just sat there waiting, the same way I did. Klaus looked at me for a long moment. Then he brought my hand up and pressed his mouth to my knuckles. Not performance, not gesture, just the simplest possible expression of something that had no better form. I'm sorry I wasn't here, he said against my hand. Wake up earlier next time, I said. He made a sound that was almost a laugh, the first one, and it was rough and imperfect and entirely him, and I held on to it like the best thing I'd heard in 6 months, because it was. I found Nico in the estate garden the evening before he told me he'd be moving his base of operations back to his own place, now that Klaus was stable enough to come home within the week. He was standing near the low wall, the same garden. He'd chosen it deliberately or hadn't, and I decided it didn't matter. I stood beside him. We looked at the tree line for a while in a silence that had become, over weeks, something comfortable without either of us planning for it. I need to say something, I said. You don't have to. I know I want to. I turned to face him. He turned to face me. In the evening light he looked tired and unguarded, and entirely himself, not performing equilibrium, not managing the room, just standing in a garden being a man who had been carrying things for a long time, and was beginning, incrementally, to put them down. What you did for us, Raphael, and me, and Klaus, and this family, you did it without asking for anything in return. You showed up and you stayed and you covered us when it counted and you stepped back when I asked you to. Livia, I'm not finished. I held his gaze. I felt things I didn't plan to feel, and I made a choice about them that I would make again. I need you to know that the choice wasn't about you being insufficient. It was about what I owe to the life I built and the man I built it with. I paused. And I need you to know that you are... I stopped. Started again. You are someone worth knowing, Nico Morrow. On your own terms, completely separate from your brother, completely separate from this family and everything it cost you. I held his eyes. I hope you find somewhere to put that down. The silence was the longest we'd had. Nico looked at me with the expression I finally had a name for. It was grief and respect, and something underneath both that was its own thing, quieter than either, more permanent. You're extraordinary, he said. Simply, factually, the way he said everything. For the record. I know, I said. I've been told. The corner of his mouth lifted, the full half-smile, and I gave myself one moment, just one, to feel what it felt like to receive it, and then I let it go cleanly and completely, the way you let go of something you've decided belongs to a different life. He nodded once. I nodded once. We stood in the garden a while longer, and then we walked inside, and that was that. Epilogue. 6 weeks later, Klaus came home on a Tuesday. Not dramatically, not cinematically. He walked through the front door of our home, not the estate, our home, the one we'd chosen together, the one with the bedroom window that faced east, and the kitchen that was slightly too small and the second drawer in the study where the photograph lived, and he stopped in the entrance hall and just stood there for a moment, looking at it. Raphael was on my hip, indifferent to the significance of the occasion, engaged primarily with trying to reach the doorframe. Klaus turned and looked at his son. Raphael looked back at his father with the focused assessment of a baby encountering someone familiar from a distance that had become abstract. Then he reached for him, both arms out, the full reach. No hesitation. Klaus took him, held him against his chest the way he had in the hospital the night Raphael was born. Still, careful, like something that could be lost. Raphael grabbed a fistful of his shirt and held on, and made the contented sound he reserved for things he found genuinely worth staying near. I stood in my own doorway and watched my husband hold our son in the entrance of our home. This I thought. This is what I held the line for. This is the thing that was worth every hard day and every harder night and every choice I made and every room I was tested in. This exactly. Claus looked up and found my eyes across the hallway, and in his face was everything that had survived 6 months and a bullet, and the particular cruelty of almost losing everything. Love that had been tested and held, returned from the dark, slightly altered in the way all real things are altered by the dark, but present, and solid, and ours. Hey, he said. The same word he'd said to Raphael the night he was born. Hey yourself, I said. He crossed the hallway, one arm around me, the other holding Raphael between us, and his mouth found my hair, and stayed there for a moment that needed no narration. I'm home, he said. I know, I said against his shoulder. I've been waiting. Raphael, sandwiched between us, made a sound of profound satisfaction. We stayed like that, the three of us in the entrance hall in the ordinary, extraordinary light of a Tuesday afternoon, until the moment was done. Then we went inside, and we closed the door. Nico Morrow returned to his own city the following week. He sent a gift for Raphael's first birthday, a small, unremarkable toy that played a tuneless melody when you pressed its center. It became the only thing that put Raphael to sleep without fail. Livia never told Klaus what song it was. She didn't have to.